Chapter 14 of A Diamond Sky Above Titanic, a Good Omens fanfiction, written by SeaBlueEyes, read aloud by SkyAsimaru. If you enjoy this podfic, you can check out the original story on Archive of Our Own. If you would like to hear more of my recordings or see some of my own work, you can find me through the pen and screen name of SkyAsimaru. A Diamond Sky Above Titanic, Chapter 14, Death of Titanic. Aziraphale produced a laced handkerchief, miraculously dry, from a pocket. With a hand that shook, he wiped at Crowley's face, dabbed away the slick blood from around his mouth. Crowley touched his fingers into the icy water that was creeping up around them, and gently rubbed at the redness clotting by the angel's ear. He felt warmth suffuse his lips as soft fingertips knitted the broken skin back together, and he pressed his own fingers into Aziraphale's sticky hair, felt the gash, the wetness. His hands caressed the wound, coaxing the split skin to seal itself. He was very deliberately not looking in a certain direction, where certain broken and melted wings were twisted towards them. Aziraphale's hand was still lingering over the demon's mouth. Crowley brought his own up to entwine their fingers together, to kiss their blood-smeared tips. Then, very gently, he brought up Aziraphale's other hand. It had no fingers. Perhaps they were still wrapped around the hand in a carbonized fist. So he just brushed the hot, burnt, hard top with his lips. It took him 3 tries before he was finally able to force words from his throat. When they came, hoarse and rasping, rough as sandpaper, they felt so inadequate it would have been comical, except for the fact that it wasn't, not at all. "Thank you," he whispered. Aziraphale's corporeal throat had been nearly torn apart by his Enochian. He had to finish realigning his trachea before he could answer. When the last tissue had slid into place, he managed his own rough whisper back, with the lightest squeeze of the hand. "You're welcome." They got up. Their wings melted into the tears in their shirts. "So, what now?" said Crowley, voice like gravel. He squeezed his eyes shut as the head rush hit him, then managed to focus on Aziraphale's swaying face. "I know you don't want to hear this, but whether or not we stay isn't going to make a difference, and dying really won't help anyone." Aziraphale's face could have made God himself cry. "I don't think I could manage a flight," he whispered. Then, his whole face crumpling in misery as more knowledge set up camp. "Horomorph." "Me neither." "I suppose we had better accept that we're as helpless as humans, then." The angel's eyes defocused as he thought. "We're going down with the ship." There was a moment's silence as each being of usually relatively large power processed this humbling realization. "The rest of the helpless humans will be on the decks by now," said Crowley eventually. "Suppose we should go join them. I can't feel my toes, in any case." Nor I, dear. I can't help but agree. Neither moved, the water, completely flooding the lower half of the room, reached their knees. Then they left. They didn't look back. It was now 9 minutes past 2, and our angel and demon were presently climbing up the first-class smoking room, clasping hands, their sopping clothes heavy and hanging, like a second skin coming loose. The angle of the dying ship was so steep now that every step up burned the backs of the thighs, and gravity begged them to reconsider their upwards course. Titanic was going faster than ever. Someone was standing in front of the lit fireplace, staring impassively into the painting of Portsmouth docks. So still he could have so easily been missed and never seen again. "Thomas!" Aziraphale skidded to a halt, letting go of Crowley's hand. The two stared at the shipbuilder, poised near poetically, face illuminated by the soft glow of the coals. He was leaning into the incline of the ship, hands by his side, lifebelt discarded on the chase lounge behind him. His eyes were red-rimmed and dull. He looked like a painting of some tragic hero. He looked like defeat. Thomas Andrews turned slowly, as though he had only just realized they were there, and stared at them apathetically. Aziraphale felt his eyes burn in denial. "Aziraphale," Thomas Andrews said eventually. His listless eyes passed numbly from the angel, soaking wet, bloodied, bruised, to Crowley, soaking wet, bloodied, bruised, and with his yellow eyes as bright as lamplights behind him. "Mr. Crowley." Aziraphale took a step forward. His vision was so blurred that, for a moment, his dear friend was a faceless figure in a long gray coat, and boots that shone in the firelight. He blinked fiercely until the face came back. "Thomas, you're not... Surely you're not..." He couldn't bring himself to ask it, because he knew the answer. He understood entirely. Titanic was Andrews's beloved masterpiece. His whole heart was in this ship, and he could no more abandon her now, in her darkest hour, than he could abandon his own child. Thomas Andrews would not be persuaded. He would not be forced. Thomas Andrews would die on this ship, and there was nothing in all creation that Aziraphale could do to change that. Aziraphale used his good hand to enclose one of his friend's own. "Thomas, I'm so sorry. I'm so very sorry." He saw Andrews's eyes shine, his throat work as he swallowed. Then the great shipbuilder shook his head. "No," he whispered. His voice was broken up, low and discordant, as though any note higher and his words would shatter into splintered syllables. "'Tis I who should be sorry, Aziraphale." Aziraphale gaped. "My dear Thomas, I'm sorry that I didn't build her stronger." Andrews went on, his voice trembling, words faltering. "I'm sorry that I knew of the flaw and did nothing."
For Christ's sakes, Andrews, you couldn't have foreseen this!"
exclaimed Crowley suddenly, with a vehemence that took even himself aback. A sharp crash below the mantelpiece, muffled against expensive carpet. Rich amber liquid seeped darkly into its soft depths. The shattered crystal seemed to spit at them, dragging them all back to reality, to a world where there was not time for poetic goodbyes. Aziraphale cursed that brandy glass. "You have to leave," said Andrews quietly, a voice of reason even in a world where nothing else made sense. "Get yourselves on a lifeboat. Get yourselves out of this nightmare." "We already tried. The boats are all gone," said Aziraphale. Andrews's defeat was total. It physically burned the heart to witness. His eyes were tender as he told them. "Then be sure to stay on the ship as long as possible. Stay out of the water for as long as possible." "We know," swallowed Aziraphale. Then, sensing the final goodbye on his dear friend's lips, he impulsively reached out and enveloped him in that warm, soothing, angelic embrace that he had resisted earlier. Andrews, startled but touched, let himself be held. They came apart, and Andrews said, as he tried his very hardest to smile, "Good luck to you, Aziraphale." Then, nodding courteously to Crowley, "And yourself, Mr. Crowley." Aziraphale wasn't strong enough to reciprocate the smile. His lips quivered as he said, "And to you, my dear Thomas." He took a step back, preparing to leave, but behind him Crowley had remembered something. "Hold on," murmured the demon. The other two watched as he fished around in an inside pocket, and then paused, finding whatever it was, before slowly pulling it out to stare at it in his hands. It was a small black notebook, water droplets clinging to its leather cover, the edges of its pages wrinkled and stuck together. There was an intake of breath. Crowley, shamefaced, held it out to the shipbuilder. "Here," he mumbled, addressing the carpet. I did mean to give it back earlier." Then he forced himself to look at Andrews's face, and found himself explaining himself, a guilty child. It's just what I do. Sorry," he added, as though in afterthought, and for once there was true sincerity in his voice. Thomas Andrews's hands were shaking as he slowly reached out to take back his lost journal. He slipped a finger between two pages, peeled them apart. From upside down, Crowley could discern run ink, smudged diagrams, impeccable copperplate handwriting blurred into obscurity. The shipbuilder's eyes filled as he thumbed through his notes, all his plans for improvement, all his hopes for the future, all his hard work and meticulous calculations and beautiful little sketches, all of them now totally useless, worthless. He had poured his whole heart into Titanic, and already she was going to her grave. Tears broke and ran as a line of brightness down each cheek. He looked up, away from his work, sniffing in a vain attempt to regain some composure, and nodded his gratitude at Crowley, unable to speak. Aziraphale felt tears slide down his own cheeks, Crowley slipped his hand into the angel's. "Goodbye, Thomas," he murmured, "and good luck." He pulled Aziraphale, rooted to the spot, gently away. "Wait!" They looked back. There was an expression on Andrews's wide-eyed, tear-streaked face, childlike in its innocent wonder, a kind of confused, belated astonishment. "Who are you?" he asked of them both, his brows low over eyes that shone. Aziraphale turned and looked at him, standing there alone by the fireplace. He was perhaps 10 minutes from death. Those soft brown eyes of his were pleading with Aziraphale to tell him the truth. Aziraphale held his gaze calmly. He would likely be seeing him again very soon. "I am an angel," he said simply. There was a heartbeat of quiet, during which even the now continuous wails of the ship seemed to soften. "Demon," confessed Crowley a second later. Andrews looked between the two of them, standing there together by the rotating exit doors. The angel and the demon holding hands, each so beautiful in his own way, each the other's opposite, each just not quite human, now that he knew what it was he was seeing. "I think," he said, in a voice that was cracked and thick, "I think that I've always known." And then, slowly, he smiled, broken and tremulously. "I don't suppose," he met Crowley's yellow eyes, "that Crowley is your real name either." "No, it is my real name," Crowley admitted. For a moment he frowned thoughtfully before continuing. "But just Crowley. The first name's only a human formality." The bright lines of wetness on Andrews's face were reinforced as more tears escaped. He drew in a shuddering breath through his nose. "Then, Aziraphale and Crowley, it was an honor knowing both of you." Aziraphale felt a sob rise in his throat. "You will live on through history, my dear friend," he told him, as Crowley led him by the hand towards the exit. "You will never be forgotten." And then they were through the doors, and Thomas Andrews, master shipbuilder of the Titanic, was forever lost from sight. "I was just thinking how I don't know your name. You know, your real name, the one he gave you." Crowley, running through the Palm Springs Cafe with his beloved, was miles away. "I want to know your name. Will you tell me?" They reached the grand staircase, a hive of first-classers, dashing in all directions, and the voice in his head became soft and Irish. "I don't suppose that Crowley is your real name either." He saw Aziraphale, naked and resplendent, lying across his bed, in his arms, playing with his hair. "I'll bet it's beautiful, Crowley." Aziraphale smiled at him like an angel. Crowley was so caught up in his own thoughts that he could barely remember to put one foot in front of the other, to keep going. Aziraphale was the one dragging him now. They burst out through the reception hall doors and onto the deck. He heard the angel's intake of breath as he looked around him. Crowley looked too, his eyes focusing back on reality instead of his memories, and he too was filled with horror, so much that his train of thoughts came to a total standstill. The ship was more than halfway in the water. Before, there had been people running in all directions, people with the option to run in all directions. Now they were all going the same way, and that same way was up. The crowd was thick and mad, pushing past them on all sides, all of them shouting or screaming. The water around the ship was white froth, with the masses of thrashing people swimming for their lives or clinging desperately to floating deck chairs. So many screaming voices. People were flinging themselves overboard, hanging off the empty davits' ropes. The incline of the floor was steepening faster and faster now. It could be felt beneath your feet, your calves unconsciously adjusting to the change. It was visibly changing. Titanic, they knew, had but minutes to live now. And so did all of these people. Aziraphale, overwhelmed, made to turn away from the cries of the people he was beyond helping, when there was a sudden pinging noise, followed by the slap of something hitting the water. What was that? And again the ping and slap, then 2 more times. On the 5th, that was when he caught sight of the last of the funnel's support ropes breaking loose before thwacking into the water. They stared in horror as the funnel fell, slowly at first as it crumpled at the base, but then gaining momentum with an awful metallic groan, straight towards the water, straight towards the people swimming for their lives. Aziraphale rushed forwards, grabbed the railings, and blinked. The people who had turned in time to see their death, see the tens of tons of solid metal swinging towards them, were screaming together and holding their hands before their faces in instinctive protection. But instead of crushing them, it tore against their outstretched hands, crumpling like aluminium around them. Death sighed in disappointment. Aziraphale spun round again. "Come on, my dear. You heard the man. We need to stay on the ship as long as possible." He grabbed Crowley by the hand and made to run up the gradient with him, but felt only a pull as the demon lagged behind. "Come on, Crowley. We have to keep moving," he exclaimed in disbelief at such reluctance. "Come on, Crowley, come on! You're the one who wanted to live in the first place." His eyes were so wide, the whites completely encircled their brilliant blue irises. It was a mesmerizing sight, one that Crowley suddenly found himself mesmerized by. Aziraphale stared at this irresponsiveness with incredulity. "Crowley!" Crowley reached his decision, dragging his gaze away from those beautiful blues. He shouted into the angel's ear so that he could be heard over the pandemonium. "It's Coca Bill!" Aziraphale stopped pulling. Around them, people continued to shove past, running for their lives. He turned around slowly, and his mouth opened and closed a few times before he found words. Words spoken so quietly they were barely heard. What did you say?" Even under the circumstances, Crowley's cheeks darkened with embarrassment, and he found himself already wishing he hadn't brought up the topic. He pulled on the angel's hand and took the lead, dragging them both up the ship so that he wouldn't have to meet that gaze as he spoke.
That's my name! My real name!
Someone banged into him hard, shoving him into the balcony railings above a lower level of the deck. Acute pain shot through his abdomen. Ignoring it, he climbed over the bars and turned to offer his hand to the angel. Aziraphale was doing the translation in his head, miles away himself now. It was only Crowley's hand in his that helped him keep his balance as he awkwardly pulled himself over the railings. The chaos around them was reaching its climax.
"Star of God,"
he whispered. Then, louder,
"You're a star of God!"
Crowley cringed to himself as he caught his old title. He jumped down from the other side of the rails, held up his hand for Aziraphale to complete it again. They stood there together above the writhing crowds, faces inches apart on the tiny platform, the top of a water tank, or boiler perhaps, and stared one to another. Aziraphale's face was near alight with his amazement and a kind of overwhelmed gratitude, as though thanking the demon for his confidence. Crowley's was near alight with his discomfort.
I was never any good at it,
Crowley told him desperately. Up there, away from the masses, everything else felt like background, just irrelevant detail. Aziraphale's sodden, wonder-struck face was filling his whole world.
It was the most boring bloody job, only there wasn't a word for boredom back then, so I didn't even realise what it was I was feeling. I thought I was the only one. Cockabel and Raphael seemed to love it. They were the guys in charge. I was just the galley slave running errands.
Aziraphale shook his head in astonishment.
But you don't even like astronomy. Exactly! I never looked back after I fell.
Aziraphale just stared at him. Then they both jerked back to reality and turned to carry on up the ship. Crowley leapt down from the platform and helped the angel do the same.
Then Lucifer spoke up, you see.
They were at another set of railings now, this set even more crowded than the last. Lights all across the ship pulsed as they scrambled over them. They clung to the other side.
And then there was this meeting, and I just went along to hear what it was all about, 'cause I'd always thought it was just me who felt that way. You can't imagine how amazing it felt to realise I wasn't.
There was a 6-foot drop on the other side of these railings. Crowley took Aziraphale's good hand in his and helped him lower himself down before leaping cat-like to join him. Side by side again, they went on.
And then, the next thing I know,
he shouted, elbowing his way through the masses, continually half-turning around to check the angel was still with him, even as he held his hand.
The next thing I know, everyone's out there, swinging these flaming swords around, and uprooting mountains, and hurling these tornadoes of fire and blood.
There was a sudden burst of shrieks as all the lights on the ship dimmed together, as though the Titanic was an elaborate lampshade for one candle attacked by the wind. The two of them looked up in alarm, but half a second later they had pulsed back to life. Crowley shot Aziraphale a wide, yellow-eyed look of confusion as they shoved their way onwards.
Is that you keeping the electricity going?
What? shouted Aziraphale, almost tripping as someone pushed past him.
I thought you were doing it.
They had reached the foot of some stairs. Stopping in front of them, they stared at each other in dumbstruck comprehension as it hit them at the same time.
The engineers!
Crowley could only read the words on Aziraphale's lips.
They're still down there. My God!
Around them, the ship groaned in agony.
Come on! We have to keep moving!
Crowley started up the stairs, shoving some old fool out of the way who was hogging them, and intoning the words of the holy prayer as he walked. Bloody Bible bashers! Behind him, Aziraphale was still reeling from their terrible realization, but was powerless to stop the immense pride for humanity welling in his heart. Oh, they were the strangest and most wondrous creatures. Here they were in the darkest of days, the greatest of tragedies, and yet even now, or perhaps especially now, they were capable of showing such selflessness, such nobility, and they would die for it.
They will be rewarded,
Aziraphale reminded himself.
They will not be forgotten.
They reached the top of the stairs and ran up the deck. In front of them was a priest, and a sight so strange and wondrous and human. At his feet, praying, was a congregation.
O Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Even in their present state, and with Crowley's revelation heavy in the air between them, they stopped and stared at the group for a moment. So did many others.
Hail Mary, full of grace, our Lord is with thee.
Crowley dragged them past. The floor was so steep now that up here, at the stern, there was a space clear of people. Anyone else up here was clinging for dear life to the railings. The soles of Crowley's tailored snakeskin shoes grew grips as one foot slipped.
I'm not sorry I fell, Aziraphale.
He turned to shout, half stumbling. Then, impulsively, he added,
I probably would never have met you otherwise.
They pulled themselves up the last final stretch, doubled over now, and grabbed at the railings with a gasp of relief. The knobbly iron was cold beneath their grip, wonderfully solid. They linked their arms through the bars and held each other, so that they were locked in place, locked together. The stern of Titanic was rising faster and faster. Aziraphale and Crowley clutched the other to them.
I saw the new heaven and the new earth,
intoned the priest from in front of them, even as he had to turn to grasp for something to hold on to.
The first heaven and the first earth have passed away, and there was no more sea.
More and more people were scrabbling for the railings around them, pushing against them, all of them crying out in terror and despair. Someone shoved Aziraphale's destroyed hand hard against the flagpole behind them, and he couldn't help but cry out in agony.
No!
Crowley hissed and drew the angel closer to his body.
And he shall dwell with them, that they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them.
Aziraphale, his eyes red and shining with unshed tears, turned his face so that it was against Crowley's, their noses brushing. Their gazes met.
Crowley, I just want to...
Aziraphale,
If we don't make it,
We're going to make it, Aziraphale. Don't you say that. Don't even think it.
and God shall wipe away all the tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither shall there be sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain. Aziraphale let out a sob that was warm against Crowley's cheek. For the former world has passed away. The ship was at more than 45 degrees now. People were starting to slide down the deck, their fingernails scrabbling uselessly against the smooth wood. More and more threw themselves over the railing into the sea below. But it was too late. They were 100 feet in the air. They were too high. Crowley felt his own feet slipping. Against him, Aziraphale pulled himself up as he almost lost his hold. More and more were falling, shrieking as they slid. The priest's congregation was no more. The priest himself out of sight. And yet still Titanic climbed higher, faster and faster, and still the angel and the demon held on. And still they saw the dying ship through one eye, and their beloved through the other, even as their feet slipped away beneath them, and they half hung from the railings, and their only salvation was in their embrace. Soon now. Then every light on the whole ship went out as the engines and their brave engineers finally failed. Screams rose in the darkness. The ship herself roared in grief. Then Crowley and Aziraphale felt Titanic snap. Around her midriff, wooden planks were splitting, with cracks like gunfire. From deep within there came screeches and thundering roars, explosions and eruptions. Crowley and Aziraphale didn't see the orange fire, the blue sparks of electricity, the shot of white light that lit up the great rupture in the ship's center. They didn't see the backbone of the Titanic crumple and snap. They didn't even realize what was about to happen. Then the rear of the Titanic, 200 feet in the air, fell from beneath them, and the world was upended. Their screams were wrenched from their throats to vanish with everyone else's. Every soul on board. Gravity had never been felt so strongly. Surely never. So strong there was no up and down distinction. No sky and sea as separate entities. No heaven or hell. Barely life or death. They seemed to fall forever and ever, falling through chaos, perhaps even chaos, all the while waiting for the crash when they would hit the water. A crash that wouldn't come, like a future forever a day away, a horizon forever a mile away, an ocean another 10 feet away. The spray, when they did finally fall horizontal again, was so great it flew 30 feet in the air. Every passenger clinging to the railings was slammed against them with the force of the impact. Crowley, wrapped around the bars, gasped in pain as his arm twisted in ways it shouldn't, and pulled Aziraphale closer as his ruined hand uselessly pawed at the metal, fighting to get a better grip. There were 2 great crashes from behind as the last upright funnels toppled. They were horizontal again, level, the ocean so close. One woman cried that they were saved. No, Crowley knew. No. And then, barely pausing to catch her breath, Titanic began to rise again, faster than ever. Crowley saw exactly what was going to happen.
Come on, Angel! We have to move!
He was up in a heartbeat, swinging a foot over the railings to the other side and extending a hand to help Aziraphale over. Only Aziraphale couldn't move.
Crowley!
The angel cried, his good hand slipping.
Aziraphale!
Crowley freed a hand and grabbed the angel by the wrist of the blackened stump, intending to pull him up against him. But the stern was rising steeper and steeper, even faster than before, and all around them people were falling and slipping and screaming.
Crowley!
Aziraphale cried out in terror and pain as his hand slipped from the rail, and only Crowley's hold on his wrist kept him from falling. Crowley, pressed against the rails from the ship's angle, groaned under the sudden weight and the pain of the bars digging into his ribs.
Hold on, Aziraphale!
He gasped, freeing his other hand to double his hold.
I won't let you go! I've got you!
But he didn't. He could feel his hands sliding from his beloved's wrist as he lost his foothold on the bars, as he was tilted more and more horizontal, as he felt more and more weight heave at the hand that gripped the railings, as his yellow eyes grew wide with sudden panic as the inevitable played out.
Aziraphale, listen! Swing your other arm up and wrap it round the railing. Then pull yourself closer and I'll pull you over,
Crowley instructed urgently.
Do it, now! I've got you! Come on!
Aziraphale panted as he swung his good arm up, but it caught around the rail first go. Crowley hauled at him as the ship's gradient steepened, so fast now, so terribly fast, as though gravity had been reversed. So fast the air pulled hungrily at his shirt, trying to drag him over to his doom. And how awfully far below it would be to the icy waters. Vertigo sunk its claws in like nausea.
Now, come on, help me here. Pull yourself over,
he cried. Aziraphale's entire arm was screaming in agony, so acute he was unable to draw breath. 1,000 needles, 1,000 daggers. Such pain human bodies were made to withstand, stretching his veins, locking his bones, ingesting his flesh.
I can't! Crowley, I can't! Yes, you can, Aziraphale! Are you an angel or are you a bloody human? Now come on! Pull yourself over! Come on, Aziraphale!
And Crowley pulled at him, and Aziraphale's feet found the near horizontal railings and pushed against them, and he forced that pain out of his mind and focused only on life, on Crowley, on what he had to do for the two to ever be interconnected. And together Aziraphale was pulled over, panting and gasping, as all the while people fell around them to their deaths, until they were both side by side again, on top of the railings, staring down at the Titanic as she went completely vertical.
Hold on!
Shouted Crowley. He glanced over his shoulder, saw the 3 gigantic propellers, the barnacle-encrusted belly, the dark sea, waiting for them. Aziraphale wrapped his disfigured wrist around Crowley's own, gripping the ship with his other hand. And then Titanic went completely still, completely silent, as she reached the peak of her ascent. Lying with their arms wrapped around each other, the angel and the demon couldn't breathe.
"Hold on, Aziraphale."
Crowley's words came out as a moan this time, a moan of despair. Below them were screams and crashes and metallic thumps as people lost their hold and fell like flies. They fell onto other people, who too fell onto yet more others. All around came shrieks for help. It was more than a tragedy, more than a nightmare. There was no word for such a massacre. How long they stayed there, poised completely upright, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, they would never know. Perhaps it was 30 seconds, perhaps minute after minute. It felt like forever. They didn't speak. They couldn't. There was nothing they could say. And then, steadily, groaning and wailing, Titanic began her descent.
"Oh my God, Crowley, this is it!"
moaned Aziraphale. Crowley didn't say anything, but the angel could hear his gasping breaths beside him. He wanted to turn, to look at him, to see that face again. But he couldn't tear his eyes away from the ocean coming towards them, destroying, engulfing, the whitewash of the spray around the base, the people still falling, the ship slowly disappearing from view, never to be seen above water again. 40 feet. Crowley and Aziraphale pushed themselves upright, holding the railings with one hand and their beloveds with the other. Warmth and reassurance on one side, coldness and doom opposite. 30 feet. Every muscle in their bodies was unconsciously tensing, preparing for the inexpressible cold now just seconds away. A million teeth, intolerant of such warmth in its icy chaos, just waiting to tear apart the lives so rightfully their own. 20 feet. The hands that held the warmth tightened their grips, as Crowley said, with words as jagged and distinct as shards of ice,
"Do not let go of my hand, no matter what."
Aziraphale's head moved convulsively in a wordless nod. 15 feet. Aziraphale unlocked his strangled throat enough to force out 3 words. They came out in a high rush of strained nonchalance.
"Love you, dear."
10 feet. Crowley's head moved convulsively to shoot a glance at his beloved. At 5 feet, he forced out his own reply, equally casual, equally splintered. "Love you, angel." Their hands, if it were possible, tightened further. And then the unsinkable Titanic, the ship of dreams, the masterpiece of Thomas Andrews, finally disappeared beneath the dark surface of the Atlantic, sealing the doom of more than 1,500 people before finally meeting her own. Crowley and Aziraphale held their breaths and went down with her. To be continued in Chapter 15.
Thank you for reading. Please drop by the archive and let the author know what you thought of their work.